Okay, so this is going to be a little shorter, hopefully, um, but I just wanted to touch really quick on the races and the classes. And I'll be touching on races a lot more briefly than classes because it can be a lot different depending on what your game master decides and the world they've built. So these are just the kind of defaults for what the creators of Dungeons and Dragons, Wizards of the Coast, have set up. But I mean, I believe this resource is free, the player's handbook. But yeah, if you just go to D&D Beyond, you should be able to read this in depth if you want. But as you can see here on the left, we have dwarves, elves, halflings, which are based on the hobbits of the Middle-earth world. I mean, halfling's kind of an older term than that, but just think of them like that. Human, dragonborn, which are like dragonoid people. They're not like the ones in the Elder Scrolls. We have gnomes, half-elves, half-orcs, and tieflings. And tieflings are like these kind of big, sort of demon-esque creatures. But so each race has its own kind of um, thing that it's good at, in terms of like different races will get different bonuses to different stats. And depending on the race that you pick, you also may end up with certain perks that will help you more. And you might end up with more like languages or things like that. And this really shouldn't matter that much in your campaign. Sometimes people can be very particular about it, but the race that you pick shouldn't really impact that much. You might end up with some NPCs who will treat you differently depending on what race you are, but this shouldn't ever bar you from doing certain things. And each race has a sort of default recommended alignment, but that doesn't necessarily apply. It might be completely different for your game. And so just don't think that you have to conform to whatever the book says about these races. I mean, for example, for the orcs, I believe it says that they are typically more evil aligned, but that's not something that needs to be followed strictly. The last campaign I was in had orcs as a highly lawful society, sort of like ancient Rome. So they're very warlike, but they weren't evil. They were just very warlike. And this can also be kind of used to add some flavor to your character's background. If the society that your game master determined is one way and your character's another way, that might be a reason that they left, or it might be something that impacted certain parts of their backstory. Again, this is all very, up to you. It shouldn't be that big of a deal, but it can be a big deal if you want it to be. So here we have the classes, and again, D&D Beyond has very good sort of descriptions of each of these. They can get very, very lengthy, but I'll just try to go through them sort of quickly. So first you have your Barbarian. Like it says here, the primary stat that you want to go for is going to be Strength. So your Barbarian's going to be kind of like your tank, but they're also going to be they have very good offense. They are not purely tank. So that's it. I mean, Barbarian's just the best way to describe it. I think it's exactly what it sounds like. Next you have your Bard. Like it says here, their primary stat is going to be Charisma. And so bards are going to be sort of your... They can be off healers if you want them to be, but they're also going to be a good source of buff and debuff. Because they have a lot of different moves that can change stats. But they're also one of the only other classes that can cast healing spells. So using them as an off healer can be advantageous, but you don't have to do that. I mean, all of this is, again, just recommendations. Next you have clerics. These are my favorite class. Their primary stat is going to be wisdom. Clerics are going to be very good for tanking, and they're the primary class who can cast healing spells. They have access to more healing spells than any other class. There are only 2 other classes that can cast healing spells, and they only have like 3 each. So, yeah, while Cleric sounds like it's going to be sort of like a flimsier character, they really can wade in and tank hits. So that's going to be a very good tank class. Next you have Druid. This is a sort of spellcasting class, and their primary stat is going to be Wisdom. So they can do things like it says here, they can change into different forms. They're very good at scouting. They're very good at this sort of roughing it. They have a lot of very interesting and very unique spells that they can cast. And I mean, every single spellcasting class has its own unique ones, but Druid has probably the most, like, fantastical spells. So it's definitely something that appeals to a lot of people, I think. Next you have Fighter. This is sort of the, like, everyman class. You can see here, their primary stat, Strength or Dexterity. And these are just going to be, they're not very good for tanking necessarily. They can be if you want them to be, but they're really just the, get the job done, the middle of the road class. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing outstanding about them. They're just, they get the job done. They're great. And it's also nice to have a fighter because sometimes people get very caught up in the idea of like, oh, I gotta, use all my buffs and debuffs and my spells and stuff like that. I've gotta make everything look so fancy. Fighters, they really get the job done. Monks, you can see here their primary stats, Dexterity and Wisdom. And monks are hand-to-hand. So they're very interesting. I really like monks, but I've never played one. They have a lot of really great, just sort of like out of combat skills that can really help them with a lot of different things. They are they're fast and they're strong, and I would recommend them if you're looking for a class that isn't a spellcaster, but is going to just be an interesting fighter to play. Next we have Paladin. That's another sort of tank class. And Paladins are the other class that can cast healing spells. So them and Bards are the sort of off healers that you're going to be looking for. But Paladins are like just very, very good tanks. You see here their primary stats are Strength and Charisma. Paladins are... Whereas a lot of things you can sort of bend the rules and say like, oh, like, well, the way things are, like, I'm not like that. Paladins are sort of more strict. So, like, my cleric wasn't part of a church. She was, like, a pagan. But paladins have to, at one point in their life, be part of a sacred oath or, like, a religious order. They can't really just decide to be paladins. And I mean, again, there are exceptions to this, but for the most part, at one point in their life, they have to have been part of, like, a religious order. And there are lots of evil gods and goddesses and powers in Dungeons and Dragons, but for the most part, you're going to see paladins as this very morally strict sort of character, which that doesn't necessarily mean they are good. Again, they might be morally strict in that they, are always carrying out the will of an evil being, but you're not going to have a lot of like the fun-loving paladins for the most part. And again, always exceptions. You have rangers. These are similar to druids in that they're kind of scouts and they're sort of off the grid, and they don't necessarily like a lot of these characters aren't going to end up being like city dwellers. These are just kind of people who rough it. And they have some very, very strong abilities. It's kind of amazing. These are also there's also a class that can be like a beast master. You have rogue. Primary stat is dexterity, and they are exactly what they sound like. They are stealthy. They are quick. They are quiet. They also have a lot of very good abilities that can be helpful to an entire party. They're exactly what they sound like, and they're great. You have sorcerers. Their primary stat is charisma. Sorcerers are, like it says here, a spellcaster who draws on inherent magic from a gift or bloodline. So magic's like a part of their blood. It's not something that you can necessarily train in. So they're kind of, for the most part, they're kind of outcast-ish. They're not typically like, if you were in like a major D&D city and someone saw like a paladin, then like, they're gonna be like, oh, like, whoa, okay, that's a paladin, I'll give them some room. But like a sorcerer, that's not gonna be a character that's very accepted, except in like their own sort of realm of other sorcerers. But as always, exceptions. Next we have warlock. Their primary stat is charisma. Warlocks are very difficult to play. They can only cast a couple of spells at a time, whereas other classes can cast spells like basically all day. But I mean, we'll get more into that later. So they have to. A warlock gains their abilities by making a bargain with a deity or like a otherworldly being. And so they, again, this is all like perspective and basis to basis, or case to case basis rather. But warlocks are possibly more frowned upon, they're definitely more frowned upon than sorcerers. You'll see warlocks have to be in communication with the being that gives them their powers, and sometimes these beings will ask them to do favors for them, and that is it's just the root of their power. It's like your boss coming and telling you what to do, but at all times, anytime they want. And finally, we have wizard. Their primary stat is intelligence, and they're pretty classic. They're very flimsy, but they're just classic. If you like spellcasting, then you're gonna like playing wizard. Wizards are also unique in that, so every spellcaster has sort of like a set of spells that they have to pick, and then those are the ones that they can cast. And this is, so with wizards and clerics, they get the exception. Wizards have a spell book, and they write down any spell scrolls that they find in their spell book, and this gives them access to that. But yeah, I mean, wizards are great. Everyone loves that. And yeah, that's all of the classes for the most part. Each of these has their own special um, sort of specialization, which I think I mentioned earlier. So like, I'm just gonna look at cleric because I know a lot about them. So for example, we have what's for clerics it's called a domain. So for example, my cleric was a nature domain cleric, and so every time I would reach these level milestones, I'd get these spells, and they'd always be prepared for me. Um, and so each of these has like its own set of domain spells that are they're going to know, and that can also kind of impact how your character background, I suppose. Um, and it's, I guess, just, you know, what they chose to do with their sort of gifts or their life. But yeah, again, D&D Beyond is a great resource, and it's very convenient. I highly recommend it. If there are any that you're particularly interested in, this is a great way to sort of read more heavily into something if it piques your interest. That's it.